Greetings, students. Welcome to the second video in the second module for AP Biology. In this video, we are going to be going over some key info about Hardy Weinberg, and we are going to do some practice problems. So first off, in the simulation that you just did, you should have figured out that Hardy Weinberg equilibrium is this sort of weird, non-natural phenomenon. And the reason we need it is because this theorem provides a baseline model in which gene frequencies do not change and evolution does not occur. So it's really important to keep in mind that Hardy Weinberg equilibrium is not normally seen in nature. So if it's not normally seen in nature, why is it important? It's important because it lets scientists have sort of a 0 point that they can compare real evolving populations to. So I like to think that Hardy Weinberg equilibrium is sort of like a null hypothesis for evolution. In other words, a population that is in Hardy Weinberg equilibrium is not evolving, and so then we can compare real populations to Hardy Weinberg populations to prove that they are evolving. Okay, so how do we know that a population is in Hardy Weinberg equilibrium? Well, there are 5 requirements for a population in Hardy Weinberg, and there is a handy dandy little rule you can use to remember this. So here are the pieces of that rule. So to remember this, you can use your hand, and you can use each finger on your hand as a way to remember one of these rules. So to start with your thumb represents no natural selection because our thumbs were made with natural selection. So thumb, no natural selection. Finger, well, you can remember your finger points like over here, over there. So finger is a way you can remember no migration, meaning no new people or no new individuals are going into or out of that population. Your middle finger, well, that's your longest finger. It's a really long finger. So you can think it's sort of infinite. It's very large, so it's going to be a very, very large population. Your ring finger, that you can remember random mating. In other words, mates are not using preferences to pick their mates. It's all just random. And then pinky, you can remember no mutations, I pinky promise. And so these 5 things are the 5 requirements you need for a population to be in Hardy Weinberg equilibrium. Now, if you're looking at this and thinking, well, of course, in real life, we don't have like random mating. Obviously, real people pick their mates, and all of these other things seem really unlikely. That's right. What you're thinking, your gut instinct is correct. Remember, normal natural populations are not usually in Hardy Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, so there are 2 main equations you need to do these Hardy Weinberg problems. The first is this one, P plus Q equals 1. So what this means is P is going to be the frequency of the dominant allele. So in terms we're used to thinking of, frequency of dominant allele, this would be like big A. And Q, this is going to be the frequency of the recessive allele. So in terms we're used to, we would write this as little a. So frequencies should always be numbers between 0 and 1, so they're sort of like percentages. Okay, so this is the first equation, P plus Q equals 1. And the handy thing is, if you can figure out either of these, P or Q, then you can always solve for the other one because you have this handy dandy little formula. So in a lot of these problems, our goal is going to be to solve for Q, and a reason I'll show you in a second, because Q is just easy to solve for. Okay, and then our second equation is this one, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared. So before we go through this, just think, using these same terms we wrote up here, what does this mean? Well, remember we just said P is like big A, so P squared, that would be like 2 big A's. Oh, hey, that should look familiar. So P squared This is going to be our homozygous dominant genotype. Two PQ, well, P, remember, is big A, Q is little a, so this is going to be heterozygous. And then Q squared, that's like little a. So this is going to be, write this over here, homozygous recessive. So these terminologies, all of this here, these are all genotypes. Remember that a genotype is two alleles. So an allele is just one single letter, one single version of a gene, but a genotype is going to be two of those because we have two copies of each allele, one from each parent. Okay, so those are our genotypes. But what about the phenotypes? So the phenotypes, well, both of these are going to give the dominant phenotype, right? So these two, P squared plus 2PQ, this is the dominant phenotype. And on the other hand, Q squared, this is the recessive phenotype. Okay, it's going to be very, very important in these questions that when you're reading the question, you make sure you pay attention to, is the question asking you about a genotype or is it asking you about a phenotype? Because as you can see, for dominant phenotypes, there's actually two terms that give you that dominant phenotype. So you need to make sure you're paying attention to what the question is asking you so that you know make sure you're solving for the right quantity. Okay, so these are the two equations, and this down here is actually what the equations are going to look like on your AP Bio formula sheet. So you don't need to memorize these equations. These will be given to you on the AP exam, but it's helpful to just familiarize yourself with this, and you should really be very familiar with what all of this means, because as you can see, they tell you here that P is the dominant allele, meaning it's like big A, and Q is the recessive allele, meaning it's like little a. But they're not telling you what any of this stuff means. You have to remember that this is like homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. That's up to you to remember. Okay, so let's see if we are really understanding this formula. So what I want you to do is go ahead and pause the video. You have a place in your module notes to fill in all of these blanks. So I want you to pause the video and see if you can fill all these in to see, do you understand what this formula means? Okay, here we go. Did you get it correct? So most of these I think are more straightforward. So the formula itself tells you dominant allele, that's P, it's right on the formula sheet. Recessive alleles, remember dominant allele is like a big A, recessive allele is like little a. Recessive genotype, heterozygous, all this good stuff. I think this is where students tend to get confused. So remember, phenotype, this is not the genotype. So the dominant phenotype is going to be both of these together. This is very important. This is, like I said, probably the number one place where students get confused. And if you're getting tripped up on what this means, I recommend writing on your formula sheet, P squared is big A, 2PQ is big A, and Q squared is little a. And hopefully that helps you see that, oh, these both have a dominant allele, so these are going to be the dominant phenotype, but this is the only recessive phenotype. Okay, so these are all the different variables in this Hardy Weinberg equation. Okay, so let's go on to thinking about some steps and how do we solve some of these Hardy Weinberg problems. So I have here a practice problem that we are going to do in order to help us understand these steps. So, ability to roll your tongue is dominant over an inability to roll your tongue. 63 million people live in the UK. If 5 million of those people cannot roll their tongue, what is the percentage of people who would be heterozygous for tongue rolling? Okay, well, the first thing we should do when we answer these questions, number one, is figure out what the question is asking you to solve for. So in other words, is it a genotype or phenotype? And is it dominant or recessive? well, in this problem, it is asking us what is the percentage of people who would be heterozygous for tongue rolling. So heterozygous, that is a genotype. So we are wanting the genotype. And in this case, we want the heterozygous genotype. So in other words, we are going to be solving for 2PQ. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2. Step 2, we are going to use the information in the problem to solve for Q squared, which is the recessive phenotype and the recessive genotype. Because there's only one genotype that gives us that recessive phenotype. Remember, Q squared is like little a, so if we can find little a, then we know that has to be the recessive genotype. Okay, so in our problem, it tells us rolling your tongue is dominant over inability, and then it says 5 million people could not roll their tongue. So we're gonna need this piece of information. So we're gonna look for the non-rollers. That's gonna equal 5 million people out of 63 million. Because remember, all of these numbers are frequencies, meaning they should be numbers less than 1. So we should always have some sort of fraction going on. Okay, and then we will just solve for that. So 5 divided by 63. Okay, so, oh, sorry. Okay, so this is going to equal Q squared. So that's step 2, and now we can move on to step 3, which since we just found Q squared in step 2, now we're going to solve for Q. And Q is just going to equal the square root of Q squared. So in our practice problem, Q is going to equal the square root of 0.0794. I highly recommend for these problems to always use your calculator. Obviously with numbers like these, I mean, if you can do this in your head, I'm impressed. But even with numbers that look easy, it's really easy to make a math mistake with decimals. So just always use your calculator for this. You can use one in all sections on the exam, so just get used to using it now. So that's, okay, and that's our value for Q. So that's step 3. Okay, I'm just gonna move this up a little. And now step 4, we're gonna solve for P. And remember, one of our equations, if we go back and look at our formula sheet, one of the equations is P plus Q equals 1. So now that we have Q, it's really easy to solve for P. We're just gonna subtract Q from both sides, and we'll get P equals 1 minus Q. So solve for P, P is gonna equal 1 minus Q. So in our example, P is gonna be 1 minus 0.282. So 0.718. And now we have Q and we have P. Those are the only variables. So now in step 5, we solve for the term that the question is asking for. Okay, so in our question, we were solving for 2PQ. So we're just gonna say 2PQ, and we just plug and chug. So P is 0.718, and Q is 0.282. So we get 0.405. Sorry, so we get 0.405. Okay, so are we done? Well, we want to make sure we go back and just read the problem again. So if we look at the problem, it was asking us for the percentage of people who are heterozygous, and here we have calculated a frequency. So the answer to the problem is actually going to be just converting this to a percent. So we'll just multiply times 100, and our answer is going to be 40.5%. And there we go. We have solved a Hardy Weinberg problem. Not so bad. So let's go ahead and do a couple more practice problems together before you move on to the independent practice. Okay, let's start with this problem. This is a pretty easy problem. 60% of alleles in a population at Hardy Weinberg equilibrium are dominant. So remember, dominant, that's going to be P. What is the frequency of the dominant allele? Well, the question just told us 60% of dominant, so the frequency is just going to be 0.6. What is the frequency of the recessive allele? Well, remember, P plus Q equals 1. So if we solve for Q, it's just going to be 1 minus P, which is 1 minus 0.6. So it's going to be 0.4. Not so bad. What percentage, so now we're going to want to answer all these questions in percents, not as frequencies. What percentage of the population would you expect to be homozygous dominant? Hopefully the question even reminds you that that's P squared. Well, we just plug and chug. So P squared is 0.6 squared. And like I said, it's always a good idea to double check your math on these decimal problems because you never know. Sorry. So 0.36, but it wants it as a percentage, so we need to write this as a percentage, 36%. Heterozygous, well, that's 2PQ. Same thing, let's always make sure we check our math. 0.48. And then write it as a percentage because the question asked us to. And then we'll do the same thing for homozygous recessive. Q squared. We always want to check our math. 0.16. And then let's write that as a percentage. And there we go. Those are sort of the easiest Hardy Weinberg problems. Those are the easy ones because they started by giving us an allele, so they right off the bat gave us either P or Q. So these are pretty easy problems. Okay, let's move on to one that's a little bit harder. So 14% of a population are homozygous dominant. Homozygous dominant. Okay, well, it asks us right here, what term in the Hardy Weinberg equation represents the homozygous dominant genotype? So every time we're saying something like homozygous or heterozygous, we must be talking about a genotype because that's talking about two alleles. So we're used to thinking of homozygous dominant as big A, big A. Remember, in Hardy Weinberg terms, that's going to be P squared. So in other words, P squared is going to equal 0.14. So what is the frequency of the dominant allele? So that's P. So P is just the square root of P squared, which is going to be the square root of 0.14. So let's go ahead and plug that in. Square root of 0.14, 0.374. And then the frequency of the recessive allele, so that's going to be Q. It's just going to be 1 minus P. Once again, we always want to use our handy dandy calculator to check our math. 0.626. Okay, now that we have P and Q, we can solve the rest of the problem. What percentage of the same population would you expect to be homozygous recessive? Homozygous recessive, well, that would be like little a, right? But in Hardy Weinberg terms, we're going to write Q squared. So Q squared is 6.26 squared. So let's plug that in. .392. Remember, the question's asking us for percent, so we're going to want to convert this to a percent. 39.2%. How about heterozygous? Well, in Hardy Weinberg terms, heterozygous is 2PQ. So 2PQ, 2 times 0.374 times 0.626. I'm sorry, that's my cat. He doesn't like math, apparently. 0.468. And same thing, let's make sure we write this as a percentage because that's what the question is asking us for. And there we go. All right, let's do one last problem. This one is the hardest one yet. So in this problem, we have a population of squirrels. The allele that causes bushy tails is dominant, while the allele that causes bald tail is recessive. 64% of squirrels have bushy tails. What is the frequency of the dominant allele? So hang on for a second. I can tell you right now that this is a question that most students get wrong on the first time. So let's walk through it step by step to make sure we're really being careful. So first, the question wants us to solve for frequency of the dominant allele. Okay, so that frequency of the dominant allele, it wants us to find P. And in the problem, we have been given 64% of squirrels have bushy tails. Okay, well, is bushy tails a genotype or a phenotype? Well, bushy tails, that's how the squirrels look, right? So that's going to be a phenotype. Is it dominant or recessive? Well, it tells us in the problem that bushy tails is dominant. So, dominant. So in other words, the dominant phenotype is 0.64. But what are the possible genotypes that result in bushy tails? So remember, genotypes, bushy tails could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, right? Or in other terms, in Hardy Weinberg world, we could say that the possible genotypes that give us the dominant phenotype is p squared plus 2pq. So in other words, p squared plus 2pq equals 0.64. If your gut instinct when you solve this problem was to take the square root of 0.64 because it's the dominant phenotype, this is why you can't do that. We're trying to solve for p, but if we just took the square root of this, well, that's not going to solve for p, right? So what are we going to do? Well, instead, this is trying to give you a hint. What are the possible genotypes that result in bald tails? Remember, bald tails is the recessive phenotype. And there's only one genotype that gives the recessive phenotype. It's homozygous recessive, or in other words, q squared. Okay, so how can we find q squared? Well, for this, we're going to want to remember p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. And we just figured out here that this part is equal to 0.64. So we could say 0.64 plus q squared equals 1. Now we just need to solve for q squared. 1 minus 0.64. So q squared, remember, we always want to check our math. 0.36. So then q is the square root of 0.36, which is 0.6. So then p is just going to be 1 minus q. So p is going to equal 1 minus 0.6. P is going to equal 0.4. I would say that this is one of the harder Hardy Weinberg problems because you had to go from the dominant phenotype to the recessive phenotype to Q to P. So you kind of had to go through all the steps. So this is a pretty hard one. And that's it. So that's Hardy Weinberg problems. So I would recommend now you go ahead and go back to the module and work through those practice problems. You could either work through them on a piece of paper, or you could print off the problems and do them on the printouts. And then when you're done, you can check the answer key to make sure that your work is correct. And if you're still feeling a little confused on Hardy Weinberg after this, there's a lot of links in the module to additional resources that you can use to help you get more information to solve these problems. And that's it. Best of luck and happy studies.